I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Education here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's program on the banking industry. The Hammer forms a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of Andy and Branya Galef, for which I'd like to thank them very much. Thank you. Tonight's distinguished guest is economist and legal scholar William Black, and our moderator is Ian Masters. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing on KPFK, Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. He was a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, here we are, the stress-tested with troubled assets facing foreclosure as we wait for bailouts in the subprime of our lives. Thank you all for coming. What happened? Banks used to avoid risk and manage your money better than you could. That was their job, to keep your money safer than stuffing it in a mattress. And they used to operate in the conservative comfort zone of the 3-6-3 ethic, borrowing money at 3%, loaning it out at 6%, and getting to the golf course by 3 p.m. Then along came Ronald Reagan, who vowed to put handcuffs on the welfare queens and take the shackles off the millionaires. Shortly thereafter, we had the savings and loan meltdown, which brings us our guest, who was that disaster's chief investigator following the money. But that was a mere rehearsal for tonight's discussion, the Great American Bank Robbery. In today's meltdown, one bank, Indy Bank, cost the taxpayer more than the whole S&L ripoff. Tonight we will learn how ideology-enabled criminality and political failure led to economic crisis as Wall Street bought Capitol Hill, allowing a select few to rig their own private casino, manufacture their own chips, leverage the pot into the stratosphere, bet the house and bring it down, only to be rescued by the beleaguered taxpayer who is told that the overcompensated who brought us to the brink of global financial collapse are too big to fail and must be bailed out, not blamed. Meanwhile, they avoid the punishment of capitalism as they enjoy the rewards of socialism. And even though we own them, they won't even show us the books to find out how bad the mess they made is. Starting in 1987, instead of rewarding savings and as a substitute for increasing wages, Alan Greenspan opened the floodgates of credit, ladling out cheap money with lower and lower interest rates to encourage consumption on credit. Then, as we produced less and consumed more, buying too much stuff we could not afford with money we did not have, borrowed from the Chinese and the Japanese, we end up 3 decades later with a few winners and a lot of losers. The biggest loser of all may be American-style capitalism itself. In retrospect, Greenspan was overrated, and his free market fundamentalism, coupled with rampant fraud, outrageous leveraging, and reckless credit, have led us to a point where, ironically, Greenspan's greatest nightmare, inflation, may emerge as the grim reaper of the mountains of debt we have piled up. It is bad enough to see your house lose value, but when your money loses value, you will know the banks and companies that should have failed have devoured our economic seed corn, leaving Main Street with potholes, but the gilded towers on Wall Street remain intact. The decline of ethics in an era of unaccountability may be coming to an end, but there doesn't appear to be any likelihood of a Pecora-style investigation to name and shame, let alone a perp walk, unlike the aftermath of the looting of the savings and loan when Bill Black sent hundreds to jail. So, as we cast about like Diogenes, searching for an honest man, let me introduce tonight's guest, who will speak for about 15 minutes, then we'll have a conversation, followed by extensive Q&A from the audience. Dr. William K. Black is a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where he teaches public finance, antitrust, law, and economics. He was the executive director of the Institute for Fraud Prevention from 2005 to 2007, and was formerly the litigation director of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and senior deputy chief counsel of the Office of Thrift Supervision. He was also deputy director of the National Commission on Financial Institution Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement. An expert on white-collar crime, Dr. Black is the author of The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And in between consulting for the government of Iceland and the World Bank, he recently appeared on PBS's Bill Moyers Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, William K. Black.
Thank you, Hammer Forum, for arranging this. Thank you, who made all of this possible, for coming. In addition to my other sins, I'm primarily a white-collar criminologist, and I focus on what happens when the CEO is the crook. Okay? So I'm going to address two primary and related questions. Why do we have repeated, intensifying economic crises? And what can white-collar criminology add to our understanding of what's going wrong and how to fix it so we can adopt better policies that can produce fewer crises in the future? And I'd like to start with a slide to get across what Ian talked about, the insanity of the system. I want to demonstrate the insanity of the system. So I'll let you read this. Okay, so this punctuation is in the original. I didn't make it up, the all caps and the triple exclamation point. Here's the context. The professional rating type guy at Standard & Poor's has been assigned to evaluate one of these complex financial derivatives that you've been reading about that cause the biggest losses. And it's a derivative that is backed by subprime home loans. And so he is asked for what's called here the loan tapes. That simply means the loan files that we put on computer tape, so that he can review a sample of the loan files to evaluate their credit risk, because that's what a credit rating agency does, right? So it's a pretty standard request, you might think. This is the response he gets from his boss, and this is a high-level boss at Standard & Poor's, that it is totally unreasonable to ask for the files so that you could evaluate the credit risk if you're going to give a credit risk rating. Right? This is significantly insane at this level, right? But why is it totally unreasonable? Well, the stated reason is that the investors, that means the investment banks that are buying these subprime mortgages, pooling them together and creating these derivatives, don't even have the loan information themselves. In other words, they did zero due diligence before they bought this toxic waste. They're now bringing it to the rating agency, which is going to do how much due diligence? Zero. Because the boss is furious that the professional guy actually wants to look. Now, what rating do you think they're going to end up giving? AAA. What is a AAA rating supposed to mean? Zero credit risk, right? On stuff that has not just a little bit of credit risk, but immense credit risk. Now, how is the guy supposed to find a way to say that something that has immense credit risk has zero credit risk? What's his boss directing him to do? That's right, make it up. That's why we pay you, right? It is your job to devise some method in which this produces a AAA without ever looking. Thank you. That completes, I will not subject you to a PowerPoint presentation. That completes the slide portion of tonight's. All right? This is a $1 trillion plus industry run on don't ask, don't tell. And you know what happened when they finally looked at some actual loan files? Fitch, the smallest of the three rating agencies, does that in November 2007. Pretty significant date because the entire market, secondary market in non-prime, has collapsed. And so they're not going to cost themselves any business at this point if they look. And Fitch says, after this small sample look at the loan files, the results were disconcerting in that there was the appearance of fraud in nearly every file we reviewed. No Sherlock, right? What do you think is going to happen if you don't look? What are they going to load it up with as long as they can get a AAA rating? Now, we know, therefore, that the people that purchased it did no credit checks that had any meaning. We know that the rating agencies gave them AAAs without doing anything. Could the buyers of these exotic financial derivatives have done any due diligence? The loan files didn't even exist for them to look at. So all those banks out there that bought well over $1 trillion of this stuff, how do you think we did stress tests? Remember the stress tests? It's like doing a stress test on an airplane wing, except you don't actually have the airplane wing. And you don't actually know what the airplane wing is made out of. But you hypothetically test it. You know, it's a farce. Okay. Back to how we got here, into this insane world where people would treat as having zero credit risk things that have massive credit risk that were sure, as soon as the music stopped, to cause trillions of dollars of losses. Right? How did we get there? Two concepts from criminology I'd like to do. One is the concept of control fraud. And that simply means what happens when the people that control a seemingly legitimate organization use it as a weapon to defraud. So in the corporate context, that's going to typically mean the CEO. And the concept of a criminogenic environment. If any of you are from health backgrounds, we stole this from pathological environments, right? And it simply looks at what kind of environments are going to create incentive structures where you're going to have a lot of crime. And we actually use the word epidemic to describe when you have a great deal of this kind of crime. So, how many people recall the subprime crisis of 1991, 1992? It's a trick question. It's a prof you're listening to. There was none, and there was none because we killed it as regulators. People were doing the same type of insane thing as lenders. We said, this is going to end in disaster, and we stopped it. And there was, in fact, no economic crisis at all. Indeed, there was essentially no cost to the taxpayers at all. I'm going to be emphasizing one variant of this kind of control fraud, and that is accounting, right? Which is the weapon of choice in the financial sphere. But I want to also, while I have you, do the 45-second version of these kind of control frauds, different variants, also maim and kill people. And if you want good examples recently, it would be infant formula in China, where you gain a competitive advantage by not putting milk in infant formula. You end up, because of that, driving the honest providers of infant formula out of the marketplace because they can't compete with people that actually use milk when you use water and talc. Okay? So we're going to be talking mostly about money, which is bad enough. In the savings and loan debacle, the National Commission that did come along and looked at the causes said that at the typical large failure, fraud was invariably present. The FBI began testifying publicly in September 2004, emphasis on that date, that there was a quote-unquote epidemic of mortgage fraud developing in the United States. So when people tell you that nobody could have foresaw that there was going to be a problem, garbage. They not only foresaw it, they warned people about it explicitly. Let's look at how you optimize these kinds of accounting fraud. And it's basically going to be three things. You're going to, and their first two are heavily related. You're going to grow like crazy. Ponzi scheme levels of growth. You're going to loan to people who are uncreditworthy because they will agree to pay you more, but also because that's the way to grow really rapidly. In the United States, there aren't a whole lot of people making $300,000 a year who weren't able to get a home loan. So you can't simply decide to grow very rapidly by making good loans, but you can guarantee immense growth if you loan to people who can't pay you back, right? The third thing is extreme leverage. This combination produces guaranteed, I want to emphasize that, guaranteed, record, not high, but off the chart profits as long as you are in the expansion phase of a financial bubble. And therefore, if any of you come from economics backgrounds, standard econometric techniques, which is simply statistics in the economics context, produce the worst possible results and the worst possible policies during the expansion phase of the bubble. Because if you look, doing things like loaning to people who can't pay you back, hey, that's associated with the highest possible profits if you run statistical analyses while the bubble is still expanding. And collectively, all of this produces, this optimization, extraordinary losses. Control frauds cause greater losses than all other forms of property crime combined. Individual losses are massive. Ian mentioned IndyMac. IndyMac sold over $200 billion of liar's loans to other institutions, getting AAA and AA ratings for the reasons we've just went through. And those institutions are going to suffer roughly 80% losses on that portfolio that they purchased. In 1 year alone, 2006, IndyMac sold $80 billion of liar's loans. Now, think of that if you had been a regulator and the seventh largest savings and loan in America comes up to you and says, hi, I've got a new strategic plan. I'm going to make liar's loans. Might that have been a clue, right, that maybe this was not going to end very well? Because that's the second thing that's guaranteed, you see. Guaranteed record initial accounting profits and guaranteed catastrophic failure. So individual failures are massive. Second thing, though, is what happens when a number of folks, because of optimization, follow the same strategy? You're going to get a financial bubble. And you're going to get one that extends and hyperinflates. By the end, 40% of all mortgage loans in America were non-prime. And that's a massive market. So that's just off the charts insane. And when bubbles hyperinflate and extend, you get economic catastrophe following them. Third, At law, the element that distinguishes fraud from other forms of theft is deceit. Fraud is all about me creating trust in you, the victim, and then betraying that trust. As a result, there is no more effective acid against destroying trust than wide-scale fraud, especially by elites, and you don't get more elite than CEOs. Right? When you lose trust in economic markets, entire markets shut down. Give you an example. Everybody's been at a picnic or a conference where there were bottles of water given out. What if you knew that 1 bottle in 100 was contaminated? How many of us would be drinking those bottles? Long before fraud becomes endemic, it can shut down entire markets. Regulators have not shut down these financial markets. Bankers have. And they have because they no longer trust other bankers. And it's because they know what games they're playing, and they're afraid that their peers are doing just the same. The average chief financial officer in America lasts 3 years. Do you see why they're short-term in their perspective? Now add executive compensation to that with massive bonuses if you hit the number. And the number is set quite high in terms of short-term counting profits. How long am I going to last as a CFO if I don't do these subprime loans and my rivals do during the expansion phase of the bubble? 1 quarter. Right? 1 reporting result, my CEO doesn't get his big bonus. Gone. We call this a Gresham's dynamic, in which bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. And that's how perverse things became. Think how many layers have to fail to have these kinds of epidemics that we've been discussing. First, all that corporate governance stuff that you read about, that has to fail. Well, that's pretty easy because the tone at the top, when the crook is at the top, is a fraud-friendly tone, something never discussed in corporate governance literature. Then there are external controls, right? That's the outside audit firm, the appraisers, right? That working very well for us? Is that new? Did they work well in Enron or WorldCom? No. They all had clean opinions. All of the savings and loan frauds had clean opinions, and they always came from top-tier audit firms. How about the rating agencies? That working real well from what we saw? No. These entities, you don't destroy external controls. You suborn them, and you turn them into your most valuable allies. How about, anybody hear the concept private market discipline? This is the essence of modern finance theory. And the economists that believed in it said that it was so wonderful, and I'm now essentially quoting, that a rule against fraud was not necessary or even particularly important. So we didn't even need rules. We didn't need the SEC. We didn't need laws. We didn't need prosecution. Markets simply stopped all frauds. But when there's a Gresham's dynamic, whether it's in China with infant formula or the United States with executive compensation, private market discipline becomes perverse, and it drives good practices out of the market. And so it isn't discipline, it's an incendiary. It's like an accelerant, if you think in arson terms, the gasoline you pour on the fire. And then, of course, there's regulation. Regulation also had to fail, and it can fail in any of 4 ways. There can be no regulation. There was essentially no regulation of most of the non-prime lenders. There can be deregulation. There can be desupervision. The rules stay in place, but you appoint leaders who don't believe in enforcing them. And so the classic one was the people who were supposed to be regulating IndyMac, where the chairman of the regulatory agency came to the press conference with a chainsaw posed next to the 3 leading banking lobbyists with pruning shears, all posed over federal regulations to indicate their intention to cut through all federal regulation. Well, they succeeded in that mission, and you've seen the result. And of course, you can get capture as well, in which the regulators do the bidding of the industry, which I would say is largely what we have now. How sick does this end up? It ends up in producing these kinds of recurrent economic crises. And if any of you have been subjected to economics and remember it, if you were ever told about Pareto optimality, which simply means that when the genius of a market is in voluntary transactions, normally both parties are made better off, right? I give up the $20 and I get that really good tikka masala and I feel better off. The restaurant is better off as well. They'd rather have my $20 than the tikka masala, right? That becomes perverse when you have these kind of control frauds. So in the typical non-prime loan from 2005 on, both parties to the transaction were made worse off. The borrower was made worse off. Indeed, there's been no greater destruction of working class wealth in American history than this crisis. 80% of the losses, according to the FBI, from mortgage fraud come when lender personnel are involved. In other words, control frauds, again. But the banks aren't made better off. That's why they're failing. So the party to the transaction, the bank, is made worse off simultaneously. Who gains? The agents, we call them, the CEOs, the loan officers that get bonuses for making bad loans, the accountants, the appraisers, those rating agencies. By the way, their profits skyrocketed by giving AAAs to stuff that was disastrous. And with that in mind, I will stop so that we have more time for you to ask questions. Thank you very much.
This is Bill's book here, and he was just showing me a telegram from Keating of the Keating 5 Savings and Loan that said, if we can't get Congress to stop black, then kill him dead. That's about as flagrant a threat that you get. It's actually a threat in writing. And I said to Bill, well, I said, surely Keating should have gone to jail for that. And he said, oh, no. His excuse was he was a lawyer writing to his lawyer, therefore it was privileged communication. Anything you want to add to that little anecdote?
Well, he did say it was his highest priority to get black, kill him dead. I think it's the nicest compliment you can get as a regulator.
So, given that you went through that experience and you actually put people in jail, and for some reason or other, you make this case where you use the word fraud, that's the sort of glue in your statement, really. And I don't see anybody even being indicted, let alone going to jail. So how come we have this massive fraud but no accountability?
Well, you don't have regulators right now that are quite the same, I think, as you had in our era. In addition to that, get black, kill him dead, Keating sued me in my individual capacity for $400 million. It gets hard to get a home loan when they say, what are your contingent liabilities? And you say, there's not enough space on the form to list them. He hired private detectives twice to investigate me, that we know of. They removed, our agency in Washington removed our jurisdiction over Lincoln Savings because we recommended he placed in receivership.
That was done through the Congress, right?
That was in response to the pressure by the Keating 5, the 5 U.S. senators. We refused to give in to that pressure, but our eventual bosses in Washington gave in. I really need to mention Ed Gray, who was the head of the agency during this period of re-regulation, who came from Southern California, staunchest conceivable Reagan Republican, and had a road to Damascus experience. The Justice Department under President Reagan threatened to indict him for closing too many insolvent savings and loans. Have we had that problem recently with our regulators? Overly aggressive at closing insolvent banks or savings and loans? No. Gray also, and you know, at the top, and we in the trenches, put together a real program of going and supporting criminal prosecutions. And it led to the felony convictions of over 1,000 senior insiders. There are only 3,000 savings and loans. So that was about the greatest success ever. And we went after places like Lincoln while they were still reporting record profits. We didn't wait till they were admitting that they were deeply insolvent many years later. Have you seen that happening recently? No. The Justice Department didn't even begin to investigate the large lenders, non-prime lenders, until spring of 2007, after the entire secondary market in non-prime had already collapsed. And there have been 0 indictments since then.
So there's no regulators. What about the FBI, and what about the law? Is the law still extant? I mean, is there something that they've crossed a line massively? Trillions of dollars have gone south. The taxpayers had to ladle all this money into this black hole.
Well, to give you an example, I'm a serial whistleblower. You know, so I got to testify against the Keating Five, testify against Speaker Wright. There are probably folks in the audience who remember him. He went to bat for the worst frauds in Texas. Got 2 presidential appointees of my agency to resign in disgrace. And got our head of supervision through our congressional testimony demoted about 7 levels. Well, 17 years later, he was promoted by the current Office of Thrift Supervision to be the prime regulator for all of California for IndyMac, Washington Mutual, Downey, Countrywide, you name it. So they put in charge the worst conceivable folks. They took all the lessons we had learned painfully in the savings and loan debacle and put a negative sign in front of it and did the opposite. The FBI started out really well with this warning in September 2004 that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud. What happened is that in response to the 9/11 attacks, and you can understand why they would do this, they transferred 500 FBI agents who specialized in white-collar crime to national security. Because you can't infiltrate Al-Qaeda, but you can follow the money. Okay, so that's perfectly sensible. But they refused to allow the FBI to replace the lost agents. And that's insane.
And has anything changed?
It got worse. As people here recall, I imagine, that there were these things called Enron and WorldCom. You may recall that Enron happened almost exactly the same time as 9/11. And that WorldCom is 2002, and those whole series of failures go on through 2003 with lots and lots of these major frauds. Well, there's a lag, obviously, it takes time to make a big case against Enron. There were 100 FBI agents working on Enron alone. So when are they actually going to trial on these cases? Well, 2005, 2006. So you've already lost 500 FBI agents. What are you going to do? You're going to take the great bulk of your FBI agents and try to win the Enron case, right? And WorldCom. So you're going to assign most of your FBI talent there. And which of us, you know, we're going to prosecute the enormous case against Ken Lay of Enron. Are we going to pick the best FBI agents? Of course we are. So it's not polite, but you know that it was the second and third string left, right, to deal with the mortgage fraud. And there were trivial numbers of them left anyway. So they didn't go after the choke points. We understood we didn't have remotely enough resources in the savings loan crisis either, of course, but we understood that we had to go for the Achilles heel. So we triaged, to borrow another medical term, and we took the absolute worst major frauds. And we also passed a rule restricting growth because we knew these were Ponzi schemes. And if you restrict growth, Ponzi schemes die. So even the ones we couldn't get to and close, they were killed by it. The equivalent here, well, you just saw it in the slide. What's the obvious choke point, the obvious Achilles heel? The rating agencies. There are only 3 of them. Would give me 20 good examiners. And I could have shut down any of those rating agencies. Because they were doing this. And that'd be the first question you'd ask. Okay, so what do you do to evaluate credit risk? Now, obviously, you look at a sample of the loan files. Long silence. Well, no, actually, we don't do that. Well, then actually, you're going to stop business today. I mean, that would have been the reaction. So they didn't do that. Instead, they viewed it as a retail type crime instead of wholesale. There are 62,000 criminal referrals last fiscal year for mortgage fraud. And there were roughly 150 FBI agents. What's going to happen? Right? It's throwing sand into the ocean in those circumstances, unless you use them to target WAMU countrywide and such, and they didn't do that. And you know what the worst news is? Only regulated institutions file criminal referrals, and 80% of the loans were made by non-regulated institutions. So the 62,000 number doesn't come close to talking about the real numbers. So the FBI was simply run over. It, became roadkill.
Well, a lot of inquiring minds want to know why it is that Obama is rescuing these people who have brought the global economy to the brink of collapse, and why this sleight of hand continues with Geithner and Summers declaring them all healthy, and then the banks, of course, make a big deal about paying back their TARP money. And it is such flagrant sleight of hand because these toxic assets are still there. They just don't talk about them.
Well, then they don't exist, right?
Well, I thought there was something inexorable about.
Haven't you ever had a 5-month-old and hidden something under a blanket? It doesn't work once they hit about 8 months, unfortunately.
Right. But let's try and figure out what is going on with Obama. Why do at this moment, when you could clean house, all this money is going to prop up these discredited institutions, which actually is making them stronger, and they're going to suck more and more money out. There's not going to be any money to reinvent the economy. All this stuff about green shoots and losing our dependence and Silicon Valley and all of the hope that was there in the election hype, that's not going to happen.
Because Obama's primary economic advice comes from people who helped create the crisis. And as long as you get your advice from people that don't want to admit that they were wrong about essentially everything they did in their professional lives and that they have no useful skills because all they know is stuff that was proved to be false, I mean, you're just not going to get professors of economics who are 60 years old to stand up and say, I'm sorry, everything I taught, every policy I implemented was completely wrong. The economic theories I followed were completely wrong, and I have no useful knowledge, and I'm sorry. That's not going to happen. And if they did, why would anyone ever hire them again for anything, right? They have no meaningful skills. That's the position of Summers.
Yeah, but Obama's whole political lifeline is whether he can turn this thing around in a couple of years' time. Otherwise, you can see that the people like Dick Cheney and you've got Limbaugh wanting him to fail. They're waiting in the wings to see this whole thing crash and burn. So he's on the tightrope. So why is he listening to these people if there's an alternative? And indeed, tell us what the alternative is, because
well, first
nobody talks about that.
First, he doesn't talk to others very much. right? So there are a number of us who were involved in the successful re-regulation of an industry that was in desperate trouble, that was involved in the successful prosecution of large number of frauds, et cetera, et cetera. None of us has ever been talked to by the administration, as far as I can tell. Zero. Instead, they've gone to people who have an entire track record of failure their entire lives, right? So Geithner started out as screwing up the Asian financial crisis that people may remember, Thailand, the collapse of Thailand and such. That was his beginning. He performed poorly there. So they made him president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where he was supposed to regulate the largest bank holding companies in America. And he did absolutely nothing to prevent the current crisis. He was asked about this in front of Congress, and he said, well, I've never been a financial regulator. Well, maybe, but his job title, his job was to regulate. I'm quite willing to believe that he never regulated. So he's a complete failure there. What would he do next? He was brought in by the Bush administration with then Treasury Secretary Paulson to be in charge of the bailout type stuff, where everybody agrees that he completely screwed up, right? Nobody says anything nice about the bailout except recipients of bailout cash. Admittedly, there are a number of those. But everybody else agrees that they screwed up.
They all come from Goldman Sachs by this.
Instead of 3 strikes, you're out, he was made Treasury Secretary of the United States of America. And I haven't mentioned, that he was a tax cheat. And he's in charge of the IRS now.
Right. So that's almost like Greenspan's resume, too. I mean, he was the guy that tried to undercut you in the savings and loan.
Keating used Alan Greenspan to recruit the Keating Five, the 5 U.S. senators. And then Greenspan famously or infamously put in writing to us that we should allow Lincoln to do this stuff that eventually caused these incredible losses. It was the most expensive failure in the entire savings and loan crisis at $3.4 billion, which used to sound like a lot of money, but I know it doesn't anymore. And Greenspan said Lincoln Savings posed, quote, no foreseeable risk of loss to the deposit fund. So that was before he was made chairman of the Federal Reserve. After he got it as wrong as you can possibly get it, praised the worst savings and loan America, said it should be the model for the entire industry, we made him chairman.
Well, this is surreal, though. Why do we have the best?
No, it's real, but it's surrealistic.
But I'm just wondering if we have the best economy in the world, or we had the best economy in the world.
Yeah, past tense.
Why do we have all this enterprise in this country, and that the chumps at the top every 10 years blow it? I mean, if you're saying that somehow we have this bizarre Peter principle where these guys fail upward?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very useful to have people who are willing to tell you what you want to hear. Right? I mean, Wolfowitz was a complete disaster, and so what did we do with him? We made him head of the World Bank, where he was, surprise, a complete disaster, and got fired. But he's still treated as a highly respectable person, and they might even bring him back in some future administration. It's a very weird place, and indeed, Greenspan's biggest thing was hilarious, because he always claimed reputation trumped everything. Right, so conflicts of interest didn't matter because people would be concerned about their reputation and they'd do the right thing. But he was the leading example of where reputation didn't matter. Right, he had a bad reputation. He had a failed reputation, and we gave him the most prestigious position in many ways in the free world. Right? Presidents don't have to be prestigious, they just have to be popular and get elected. But you have to allegedly be super great stuff to be made chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States of America. It's the most powerful economic position in the entire world. And we pick people who are often have a record of failure.
So what about Bernanke then? I mean, don't tell me he's as bad as the other guys.
Bernanke's interesting. He's certainly not as bad as Greenspan, but I don't know how many people were able to watch any of the testimony or read the testimony today. Bernanke was willing to threaten to use federal power in a completely illegitimate way. You know, you do what we say or we'll fire you. One of the key things, you know, I've been emphasizing a different part of the spectrum of what you need to be a successful regulator, which is a backbone, right, and some analytical abilities.
And some political support, right?
Well, we didn't have any political support, but we didn't give a damn about politics, so that was what was critical there. But the other thing you need as a regulator is self-restraint. You have to not abuse your power, because if you do, you discredit everything. And they haven't learned that part clearly. And now they've been caught in it. Remember, the Fed is the most opaque institution in America in many ways, and they like it that way. And now you start seeing what happens when you get congressional investigations. And I don't think it's partisan to say that Congress really failed during the Bush administration in terms of oversight, right? It just didn't
That is
function
not a
that way.
newsflash, no.
And so, you know, if they actually start doing things, you mentioned Pecora. I don't know whether people understood that reference in many cases. Pecora was the investigator that we used in the Great Depression to find out how many of these really powerful people had engaged in fraud, in abuses. One of the things we discovered, for example, was that Herbert Hoover was able to buy stock at half price. Okay? If those kinds of obvious abuses, you know, to put a non-polite name on it, bribery, were the norm in this era. Now we have Friends of Mozilla that people may well have read. You know, both sides of the aisle, Friends of Mozilla. Pecora, it's important to realize, was the fourth person. The first three failed. They weren't vigorous investigators. And a little ode. One of the reasons Pecora succeeded, he was an experienced prosecutor, is that he hired as his number two guy a reporter who knew where many of the bodies were buried and how to ask questions more informally to get information. And the combination proved to be very effective. And it didn't simply disclose the problems, it led substantively to fixes that worked for about 50 years until we decided we were smarter than those folks, and we repealed
The Glass-Steagall Act.
Glass-Steagall, for example,
Right.
because we knew better.
Well, we need to get to Q&A because I know everybody's got questions here. But let's just...
What do you do? You want to ask me? You wanted to ask me what to do.
Yeah, in other words, if you think Obama is listening to these discredited guys who are part of the problem, not a part of the solution, what is the solution?
Well, we write. We take opportunities like this to try to present alternative views. We want President Obama to succeed as opposed to wanting him to fail. We very much fear that this will destroy his presidency and his reputation.
But he must know that.
I don't know. No, you have to understand how seductive a cover-up is. Because you have all these people coming to you and saying, hey, if we actually deal with the crisis, it's going to cost $2 trillion. You'll have to go in front of Congress, and you'll have to use $2 trillion, and it'll be portrayed as a bailout of rich people. And you will, how attractive is that going to be politically, folks? Not very, huh? Whereas you have other people saying, shh, just keep quiet. Say that the banks are fine, right? Wait, give them all kinds of secret subsidies, which is what we're doing, right? Keep it opaque, keep it off the balance sheet, keep it so that you don't need Congress to give you authority. Do it through the Fed. That's why we're doing so many things through the Fed, because Congress has so little authority over the Fed. And that's really attractive, right? The first one is painful, politically unpopular, and gets your administration off to a really bad start. The other one hey, most of the financial press is calling them success stories. They're all emphasizing green shoots. They take hook, line, sinker, rod, reel, boat that you rode out in, these claims that there really actually was no problem, that the banks are all the big banks are healthy. Did you know that? Why is there a financial crisis if they're all healthy? Why did Geithner tell us it was going to cost $2 trillion to fix it? It doesn't square, right? But people don't remember that. Anyway, what to do to fix it? We're trying, as I say, to give alternative views. You give people their best service when you tell them the truth, not when you tell them what they want to hear. You need to fix executive compensation so that it no longer creates perverse incentives. That's fairly straightforward, right? Because we do everything wrong in executive compensation now compared to what all the books say you should do. Again, if you put a negative sign in front of that, that's what we do. We base it on short-term accounting gains instead of real long-term performance. So change that. It's the most important single thing. Do a real PCORA investigation. Give the FBI at least 500, actually needs far more than that, needs 2,000 new FBI agents to do the case. The Justice Department needs more prosecutors as well. Hey, we got lots of lawyers in America. That's not a problem, as long as you give them the budget to do it. Prioritize, triage, go after the big players first before the statute of limitations runs. Deal with the regulatory black holes. Californians should know those. This is what produced the California energy crisis, folks.
Enron generated that one.
Enron generated that one and exploited that as part of the cartel. That was front to back, no ifs, ands, or buts, fraud and cartel. So get rid of those black holes on financial derivatives. In general, there's no reason for over-the-counter derivatives, and they're an invitation to disaster as opposed to exchange-traded derivatives and such. So those would be the 5 or 6 things that you could do promptly that would not only deal with this crisis, but dramatically reduce the risk of future crises. And of course, I'm sorry, I have to mention something else. Given our discussion, you got to appoint the right kind of folks as regulators, not the Geithners and Summers of the world, who, again, they never believed in regulation. They were rampant deregulators, and proud of it.
Well, I wanted to talk about, as bad as it is, and you've given us a plan here. I don't know how to implement it and who's going to champion it and who's even going to talk about it. But that aside, I understand that there are some more shoes to drop in terms of the global economy that may mirror what we've just gone through, and that the most vulnerable part of the global economy is Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, and they borrowed heavily in euros, and they're in the non-euro zone. They have absolutely no ability to pay back these loans. The stress on the West European banks will be such that it will drag us back into it.
Yes, we are overall, and by the we, I mean most of the Western world, following pretty much the Japanese plan for dealing with severe economic banking crises, which is to cover it up. The Nikkei...
That was the zombie bank decade, right?
Well, it's now 2 decades, right? The Nikkei remains at 25% of its peak value 19 years later. Let me say that another way. Imagine if the Dow Jones lost 75% of its value and stayed that way for 2 decades. What would America be like? Japan's in its 4th rolling recession, and it's a really severe recession, much more severe than ours currently. Spain has 17% unemployment. Iceland's collapsed. Ireland's largely collapsed. Latvia needs IMF bailout. Iceland needed an IMF bailout. You're right about Hungary and other nations are in a state of collapse, but no one wants to admit it because the Germans and others are playing the same games with their banks, Recognize losses? That would be a terrible thing. Do you know that Congress extorted the accounting profession to loosen the accounting rules so that banks could essentially give any value they wanted to their assets, and that they have done so? And surprise, those values are really, really high compared to the real value.
Well, at the moment, there's a political Band-Aid being offered. It's tied into the appropriations for the two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. A big chunk of change for the IMF that's supposed to put a Band-Aid over these vulnerable countries in the former Warsaw Pact and the Baltic states. That's being held up by the Republicans. Even Bill Gates is now pleading with the Republicans not to be so stupid. What do you think will happen if that Band-Aid's not thrown their way? I mean, in other words, can an IMF Band-Aid, will that be sufficient to stop this thing from unraveling, and then we go through another? In other words, is this Europe subprime?
Yes, it will. I mean, Hungary will collapse, right? And the local currency has already collapsed, but it will further collapse. It'll produce a classic exchange rate crisis, just like it happened in Iceland. A number of these shoes are going to drop. Here in the United States, the pick-a-pay option arms, where you got to pick what rate you would pay, and virtually everyone picked a rate that, in our jargon, is deeply negative amortization. That means you're not even paying enough to pay the interest, which means the unpaid interest gets added to your principal. Can you imagine that? Those are going to cease that feature in the next 2 calendar years. And those are huge numbers. And they're really big here in California. Very popular product. Those people are going to suddenly face dramatically increased payments on houses that have lost very substantial value, where they're going to owe probably somewhere in the range often of 130% of the market value of their house. So yes, there are many bad shoes to drop. This strategy will not work. It will make things far worse. The worst possible incentive is to leave the CEOs in charge of banks that they know are insolvent, where they produce the insolvency. Guess what strategy we followed? Exactly that strategy. And we know, both from economics and criminology and just plain human experience, that's the worst thing you can do. So naturally, it's the one we've done.
Well, but an economic collapse brings about the worst kind of politics. And we don't have an educated polity to begin with. Nobody's much is talking about what we're talking about here. So the picture you're painting means that we're going to have a crisis and a collapse on our hands, and we'll have, Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin running the country.
Well, the savings and loan debacle led to a lot of very effective reforms. The Great Depression led to a number of very effective reforms, in part because, again,
But we're not even talking reform. We're not talking prosecution. We're not talking reform.
I understand, but I'm not willing to give up. We are working with members of Congress, and we're trying to get change. The first thing you need to do obviously, whatever's gushing, you stop, you clamp a Band-Aid on. But after that, your first priority should be finding the facts. That's what we did in the savings and loan debacle. We found out why the failures occurred, and we addressed it. That's what we did in the Great Depression with things like Glass-Steagall from Pecora, and we addressed it. Well, are we going to do that now? Are we going to find the facts? This stuff about, we need to be forward-looking, we don't want to dwell in the past. What would happen if we treated air crashes that way, folks? Oh, no, we're not really going to investigate why that plane came down. And we want you to know that planes are safe. And we've done a stress test. Right. That would be a disastrous strategy, right? Our strategy has produced, of looking intensively at every major crash, has led to aviation being extraordinarily safe despite the recent Air France disaster. It's time we take financial world as seriously.
Well, let's go to Q&A, and let's try and keep the questions concise and not speeches, but questions, because this is a great opportunity to have somebody here on stage to talk with you, and this is a public forum, and the idea is to give the public as much access to these interesting people that we do bring to town. So the gentleman beside you, right there, yeah.
I understand Barney Frank, 5-10 years ago, was pushing very hard for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to go into subprime, and pushing them to push the banks to push. This was a way to get a lot of people into homes. So I haven't heard tonight government's source of problem. Government as a regulator, as a solver, I've heard, but I see a lot of government source here as a cause. Can you address that?
Sure. There are two things that people generally try to argue in terms of the government as there's three things, as a source of the crisis. The first is Greenspan's easy money policies, right? So they blame him for keeping interest rates very, very low. That has some truth in the sense that it aggravated it a bit. In other words, it made leverage cheaper. And the greater the leverage, the greater the bubble, and the greater the loss. So there's some truth, but that's still pretty marginal. The second thing that people sometimes argue as government as source is the Community Reinvestment Act, right? That has nothing to do with this. That one's pure made up. How do we know that it has nothing to do with it? Well, first, it's been in place for, I think, close to 30 years at this point. So if it was going to produce disasters, it's not a very good explanation of a current crisis. Second, 80% of the non-prime loans were made by non-regulated entities not subject to the Community Reinvestment Act. So obviously their behavior wasn't in any way prompted by the Community Reinvestment Act. Third, the institutions that were regulated and were subject to the Community Reinvestment Act, none of them had any CRA rating problems. So they weren't making these loans to try to improve their ratings. They all had great ratings already. Fourth, what changed in CRA regulation over the recent period relevant to the crisis? It was weakened, not strengthened, right? As a result of Phil Graham's actions, primarily as part of the law that repealed Glass-Steagall, the Graham Bleach-Lively. They also weakened the law on CRA. And then under the Bush administration, does anyone seriously think the Bush administration made enforcing the Community Reinvestment Act a regulatory priority? No. Did they regulate anything effectively in safety and soundness, which is what they were concentrating on? No. I assure you there was nothing coming on the CRA side. So that one is completely made up. The third one is Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie do have a role in this crisis, but it's not the one that most people think about. Fannie and Freddie, ironically, were the primary reason we didn't have a crisis in subprime much earlier, because Fannie and Freddie only purchase prime mortgages for packaging. And Fannie and Freddie's standards for prime mortgages, in general, are very good. That's a conforming mortgage in jargon. And so in the old days, the non-prime folks couldn't sell their stuff because only Fannie and Freddie could buy it. What changed? We passed a law that allowed what we call private label folks to create mortgage-backed securities. So these are primarily investment banks. And it's the investment banks that purchased the non-prime loans and then sent it to the rating agencies, like I said, and got the AAAs. So it's overwhelmingly, again, a story of actually the weakening of the creation of competitors to Fannie and Freddie that led to this. But Fannie and Freddie did purchase not loans, not subprime loans, but these exotic derivatives that got the AAA ratings, primarily liar's loans. And it did so, of course, at a time when the agency had full regulating it, which was then OFHEO, had full regulatory authority to stop it, and was run by a conservative or Republican. And not only did he not stop it, he thought this wasn't risky. You know, so, and it is true that the administration, the Bush administration, strongly pushed this stuff.
But that was the ownership
Through
society.
the FHA.
Yeah, but the ownership
That was the
society.
ownership society and
then-
such.
And it ended up that it's the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor and working class in history.
Right. So Barney Frank was definitely a supporter of Fannie and Freddie. He's far from alone. It's bipartisan support in Congress and strong support from the Bush administration, and probably would have been strong support from the Obama administration as well, except that they pretty much ruined their reputation. But they are massively insolvent because of the CDOs they purchased.
Okay, on this side, the second gentleman in next from where you are. The second one. You're the first, but
Thanks. Hi.
But you're number one, even if you don't get to ask.
You get to be next. I worked with back in the mid-'90s, and I asked the guys at the Office of Thrift Supervision, why didn't they let the S&Ls go bankrupt? And they would never answer the question until I was on the elevator with my boss one time, just he and I alone, and he said, John, very simple. We were terrified the entire system would collapse. I said, so you're telling me you let Bill Simon and all these guys buy those assets 10 cents on the dollar and flip them 30 days later? He said, yeah, we were terrified of the banking system collapse. And so that, to me, seems one of the biggest concerns of why these people have done what they've done. But I have another question. On the weekend of 12 September last year, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy at 2 o'clock on the morning of Monday, the 15th of January. By 12 noon, J.P. Morgan Chase had transferred to them, it's like 80-some-odd billion dollars. Okay, they transferred back to Lehman. Then by 5 o'clock that same day, the Federal Reserve Bank, through Geithner, reimbursed J.P. Morgan Chase for that $80 billion. They did the same thing the next day. Lehman was technically in bankruptcy as of 2 o'clock Monday morning, yet they're getting paid by J.P. Morgan Chase. Federal Reserve is reimbursing them. I've never heard of that before in my life. I've queried the guys at Bloomberg and others. No one seems to know what the hell is going on here. What happened?
Okay. So the first one, we spent the insurance fund down to $500 million. We were insuring supposedly $1 trillion in deposits. And it happened because the administration, I'm talking, by the way, this is 1986, 87. And we used all that money to close the worst control frauds. So we were operating on fumes. And indeed, we did worry every morning that there would be a nationwide run. But President Reagan refused to allow us, A, to say that the insurance fund was insolvent, and B, to seek any public funds. So, you know, that was our constraint, and we did the best we could under that constraint. I don't know the facts on your point. The most obvious thing is there may have been overnight funds, right? And if there were overnight funds, then you would have to ship them back the next day under the what's called the automatic stay provisions of the bankruptcy laws. So it's conceivable that it's less conspiratorial than you think. But if there was, in fact, a federal guarantee paid out, that would indeed be very interesting. The broader point that, you know, are the Fed and the Treasury working with the big banks, hand in glove? Yeah, of course they are.
and aren't they favoring Goldman Sachs? It's the alumni seems to be.
Yeah. Well, they favor friends of Goldman, FOGs.
Right.
So.
The lady in the back there, just behind you there with a hand up. Yes.
I just had a comment. What is this doing to our nonprofits? If you look at the board of directors of all the big nonprofits, they're all these criminal CEOs, and they don't just behave this way and govern this way by day and then put on a different hat.
Well, sure they do.
You know, I don't hear enough said that these people are considered pillars of society, and what are they doing to our nonprofits?
Well, there can be pillars of salt, if I remember the Bible correctly. And yeah, obviously there's been a long time strategy of you put rich people on your board and it's expected that they will make or have their corporations make very substantial contributions, right? And you expect them also to encourage their employees to assist the nonprofit, and they adopt a particular nonprofit. Nonprofits themselves, of course, can be control frauds as well. The Baptist Foundation of Arizona was a classic Ponzi scheme, right? So I've been concentrating here because of the economic crisis only in the corporate sphere. But yes, it occurs there, and in response to the gentleman's earlier question, government can be a control fraud, and frequently is. I assure you that I am not naive about the difficulties of government. After all, one of the proposed charges against Speaker Wright was his effort to fire William K. Black for having the audacity to blow the whistle on him. So yes, government has severe limitations as well.
This gentleman down here in the front with the blue shirt.
If Obama isn't sensible enough to follow your advice, what lies ahead for us?
I think if they continue down this road, that it will be a one-term presidency. I think that there will be the logic of the bailout gets bigger and bigger, and you have to do more and more games, apropos the gentleman's up above's earlier question. And because it's done in such a opaque way, and we do actually benefit folks who are least deserving, I think it's going to produce a scandal. I don't know why it hasn't produced more of a scandal already. We secretly, through AIG, the single biggest recipient of the secret off-the-balance sheet bailout was Goldman Sachs at $12.9 billion. And it was done at a time when Paulson, who had been Goldman Sachs CEO and gotten it into trouble by putting it into the subprime, used Goldman Sachs as Treasury's consultant about what to do with AIG. And, you know, that, I don't understand why that isn't a massive scandal. We simultaneously bailed out UBS, a giant Swiss bank, for $5 billion secretly through AIG at a time when we were prosecuting UBS for defrauding the United States of America by aiding tax evasion by the wealthiest of Americans. And we fined them $780 million, I think it was. But we gave them $5 billion. So we paid our own fine and gave them $4.25 billion in walking away change. Why?
On the board, right?
And they're not insured. Remember, AIG is not FDIC insured. We owed not a penny. I don't understand why the folks who go crazy about immigrants don't go crazy about, you know, sending $5 billion to UBS.
This lady down here on the left. There you go.
Hi, thank you, Ian, for this very informative event and the others that you do, and for your radio show. My question as an activist is, okay, the government, the Obama government is quiet. They're not seeming to do anything. What can people do, us down here? Where can pressure be put on the elites? Which elites up there would fight against this that we can? In other words, there's got to be somebody that's losing, that is also up in the corporate sphere. Who is losing out, and what can, how can pressure be put on them so that they react to help to curb this whole thing?
CEOs aren't losing out. They don't.
No, I don't mean CEOs.
But I mean, CEOs are going to decide
branch.
policy.
Right, but she's looking about interest groups to make alliances with.
Oh, okay.
To make change and do.
Well, first, we are working with many members of Congress to try to get field hearings, to try to get.
Which members of Congress? That's
Okay, so as to the first thing, we is not some standardized group, but there are a lot of folks that share this concern, and they include economists like Jamie Galbraith, Jane DeRista, journalist economist like Robert Kuttner. I'm sorry? Michael Hudson, Dean Baker. Some people, if you haven't, if that's
So
not
this
a
is this
familiar name.
economist for Jamie's group?
Jamie's group is certainly include a number of the folks, but it's not just economists and such. So we are trying, and I mean, obvious members that are helping are Bernie Sanders in the Senate, Senator Dorgan in the Senate again. On the House, some of them are sensitive to their names being, so I would try with your congressperson, and you can email me if you want more specific introductions. Well, things like CU, Service Employees International Union, is trying to take a lead in this. You have you have leading blogs. So if folks read Fire Dog Lake,
She's
or
coming.
Naked
She's coming here
Capitalism.
on the. Jane's coming here on the 21st to the forum.
Jane is real strong on this. Huffington Post is generally supportive of these types of things.
But there's no corporate powerful interest that doesn't want the whole thing to fall apart. I mean, in other words, when you're trying to do something about global warming, your enemy is Exxon, but maybe your friend is Farmers Insurance because they're going to have to insure stuff.
Right, but that's not going to apply here because the interest is going to be primarily, again, we really need to change executive compensation.
I see.
That comes from CEOs. You're not going to get CEOs supporting you on that. You will get folks like the Sage from Omaha who said some very useful things, but he's not a very conventional CEO.
Right.
And he owns Moody's.
So,
And some other things that wouldn't be so well. But
okay, the lady here with the hand up here.
I think you're terrific. You're very direct, you're giving simple statements, you're really clear and informative, and I love this. My question is, when you talk about we should contact our congressperson or somebody, we do that all the time, and people get polled, and 70% of the people in the United States say they don't want bailouts, and who cares? So that's not seemingly effective or responsive, and I'm asking you how to circumvent the usual procedures of being ignored.
I will say first that those letters do matter, but I understand the limitations of them. That's why we work with particular members of Congress. We spend a lot of time. They use us as free research assistants, right? I've spent weeks of my efforts recently, and it's always the last minute, and there's a hearing tomorrow, and what questions should we ask, and things like that. If you have financial expertise, you can be part of that process directly. If you can help answer those questions that people have. You can help do research. You can help write things. If you're a decent writer, a blog in which you explain the analysis, in which you pass on things where people have done stuff. It's very, this is why we've got much more visibility. Getting on something like Bill Moyer's doesn't occur spontaneously. It's as a result of months and months of work in other places. Sometimes you have connections to people you respect in the media, where you can set up people for those talks. Once we can get these field hearings occurring, we need attendance at the congressional field hearings. and we're going to try to get them in many places. You know, it's a question of how many chairs we can get. Only the chairs can hold the hearings. Not many of them have subpoena authority, so we're trying to work to find ones that have subpoena authority.
Okay, on this side. Where's the microphone? Just right next to you there.
I've got a two-part question. There have been, in recorded history, over 8,000 fiat paper currencies, and all of them have failed. And, you know, of course, the Fed is currently in charge of ours for almost 100 years. And they've debauched our currency to the rate of about 96%. And I like your analogy of the melamine in the baby formula. I liken that to Federal Reserve notes, whereas mother's milk would be likened to a hard currency. And my question is, what is your opinion of a hard currency versus the current system where our birth certificates are monetized, which is where human capital comes from, which is where the term in war collateral damage comes from? And my second question would be, what is your opinion of H.R. 1207, which is Ron Paul's bill to audit the Fed?
To answer the second question first, I'm one of the academics at the top of the effort to get signatories on the Paul bill. So the first one, I obviously in this setting I can't do very lengthy, but I'm not in favor of a gold standard. Gold standards produce even more severe economic crises, and they make it very hard to recover, and recovery rates for those on gold standards out of the late Great Depression were actually worse than folks on fiat, which is a term of art, currencies. So no, I'm not in favor of your ideas there. There we diverge, but on the second one, I'm all for you.
Do you have a total figure of the losses from the entire credit bubble worldwide or in the U.S.? And do you have a time projection on when the penny drops?
The estimates vary by the IMF and others, but in the order of magnitude of $4.5 trillion.
But what about there's been apparently, at least on paper, there's $9 trillion that's gone out of the stock market. There's $5.5 trillion that's gone out of housing. I mean, aren't there?
Yeah, those are not included.
They're not included
as wealth losses. This is how much to fix the losses in basically the financial institutions. I agree to you, the total impact economically is much larger than the $4.5 trillion. Not that $4.5 trillion isn't a lot.
Right. Well, you got to measure that against what, 11 trillion GDP, or what's the economy?
The U.S. economy?
Yeah.
I think it's more like 14, but
14,
yeah.
okay. All right.
Oh, well, what's left to drop is a whole host of things that we were talking about. Hungary, virtually all mortgages are denominated in, I think, euros, but people are earning in the local currency, which I think is the florent, something like that. And of course, the local currency has lost value massively relative to the euro. So, you know, they're just going to be default after just a nationwide default. Iceland has 70% of its commercial loans denominated in a foreign currency.
They were the British depositors, right? That went into their banks.
British depositors went heavily, but other nations did as well. I mean, it's not what you asked about, but it exposed huge regulatory holes in the European context as well. So part of the answer is we don't know because no one has been effectively examining banks in places like Hungary and Iceland. To give you stress tests, people mention, Iceland did a stress test of its 3 big banks in August of '08, said they passed with flying colors. The entire nation collapsed in October. AIG did stress tests and said the worst conceivable loss was $900 million. Hey, what's $200 billion among friends? Fannie and Freddie were required by statute to do stress tests, much tougher stress tests than Treasury recently used, announced in August of 2008 that the worst conceivable losses were $5 billion. Close, no cigar. You know, the question is whether it's going to be 200 billion or 400 billion for them. So these stress tests, all this really fancy modeling where we literally took rocket scientists, physicists, to do the modeling, the financial modeling, it purports to be accurate to the 7th decimal point to the right, you know, the 7th figure to the right of the decimal point. The only thing is it's wrong to the 7th figure to the left.
Gentleman here, right next to you. Back there. There he is, on your right.
I have a question regarding the role of the Federal Reserve in the economic crisis. The question is, do you agree with the Austrian school economists that the Federal Reserve has caused this recession and virtually every recession since 1913, its inception, by manipulating interest rates and the money supply? That's basically it.
Okay.
No.
Why is that?
I don't know. Well, it depends on what you mean by manipulation, but whether or not people were on gold standards, they managed to have crises long before any central banks existed. And indeed, the gold standard makes it very difficult to recover from crises.
Sir, can you wait for the microphone, please?
No, we should order in. Yes, we don't need.
Sir, can you
No,
please
we
wait
don't
for
need
the microphone?
conspiracy theories about the Fed. Of course. I know. But can you address this idea that there's some sort of mystical lodge-like cabal that sits in a room, 6 white men running the world, making stupid decisions that bring us all down? I mean, it's true that this has happened, but did it actually happen in that room?
There is a real problem with what we call theoclassical economics, in which it has become pretty much a religion, and it can't be falsified. So I read the quote, I gave the quotation earlier about a rule against fraud was not necessary or even particularly important. That was by the deans of the law and economic movements in the United States of America. A literal dean, Dean Fischel of the University of Chicago, he's now moved on, and Judge Easterbrook. They wrote that after they had tried to apply their theories in the real world, in the savings and loan crisis. And in the real world, they had praised Lincoln Savings, Fischel had, as the best possible savings and loan in America. So after getting it completely wrong, they write the book that becomes the treatise on all of this that affects policy, that has been falsified entirely by events, and they don't even mention that they tried applying their theories in the real world and they got a 3,000 position error. In other words, they took the worst S&L in America of 3,000 and said it was the best S&L in America. You can't get it more wrong, and for that they made him dean of the University of Chicago Law School.
So, okay.
So
well,
it's not a cabal, it's not a room, but it is shared beliefs that say you don't need to regulate anything, that private market discipline will ensure that everything will go fine.
that's what Greenspan's excuse is.
And that was what Greenspan, now he's done a mea culpa at least.
Well, he said, I'm surprised that it didn't work.
He said he was shocked. He thought that it was shocking that people, that would, you'd actually have fraud. And this brings back, of course, the classic Casablanca moment.
Right. Okay, the lady up here with the white sleeves and the hand up.
Always wear distinctive clothing when you come to these events.
Thank you. I'm still trying
to
understand if what you're saying is that the reason in the face of this flagrant, widespread, in-your-face fraud is cover-up. Okay, so if it's cover-up, psst, don't say anything, you'll lose your reputation. All right, that's majorly what's going on. Why can't we call that conspiratorial?
Well, what difference does it make? I mean,
Well,
anyway.
because it is. And what's wrong with calling it that? Why,
Well, I think the idea
I
would
think
be
the
to put some
problem
people
is
in jail, wouldn't it?
tactical, that as soon as you say it's a conspiracy theory, you get dismissed by most folks. You don't need, let's take the savings and loan stuff, right? There were frauds all the time that were known as, I'll trade you my dead horse for your dead cow. You got to love Texans, right? And this is, I've got a really bad loan, and the pesky examiners are requiring me to recognize losses. And if they require me to recognize losses, they'll take me over, and it'll all be bad for me. And you've got a bad loan, the same thing. Well, I'll buy your bad loan, and you buy my bad loan. And we'll both buy them for above original book value. So the losses will disappear, and like an alchemist of yore, it will be transmuted into a gain. Now, those folks do meet the literal definition of a conspiracy, right? They got together and they conspired. And in fact, in Texas, there were meetings of some of these sleazoids, and they did have a common representatives, it being Texas again, right? But in another sense, none of it was necessary, right? They had a community of interest. And it's just, I'll scratch my back, you scratch my back. They didn't need to meet monthly. They got together informally in bars and such, and they had a problem, you have a problem. We all have some drinks, and we solve our problem.
Okay. I think we're coming up to the end here. This gentleman right in front here. Actually, we'll have two. You and the lady there. Him first, yes. And then I think we'll call it a day, because I know a lot of people want to talk to Bill here, but we've got to be out by 9, so.
Ian said that you were consulting for Iceland. What is the current state of it now? What's the optimistic projection? Can it provide any kind of a role model for what I anticipate we will probably be going through in another 2 years as all of these other shoes drop?
Iceland's in enormous flux. By the way, there are a couple of videos that people want to look at on YouTube and such of talks I gave and an interview in Iceland discussing these things in more depth. Iceland has got many folks willing to change. They very much fear a problem, not perhaps unique, but special to Iceland. I dubbed it the third cousin problem. And that is, it's such a small country, 300,000, that if you have a staff of 20 investigators, it's guaranteed, statistically almost, that one of them is going to be at least a third cousin of somebody you're supposed to be investigating. And I didn't raise this. This is the one that they repeatedly came back to and said, how are we going to try to fix it? So I'll say at this point, they're more open to change. They hired Madame Jolie, who probably people here haven't heard, but she investigated ELF in France, which is amazingly politically connected, and ripped it to shreds. That's a good sign. So I think we'll have to see. Their new head of supervision had me address their entire staff, but he's been in charge at the point where I talked to him, which is now 3 weeks ago, for 13 days. So I can't tell you whether it's going to work.
But they've literally hit rock bottom.
Well, all three of their biggest banks collapsed. Their three banks collectively had liabilities 10 times the GDP of Iceland.
And nobody noticed, right? Nobody noticed this happening.
Well, actually they did, but famously the Brit
Right.
head of the Royal Economic Society praised them.
Right. Right, because they were attracting British customers, weren't they?
Oh, massively.
Massively, right. Okay, the lady there, and this will be our last question.
Okay, you know, you talked about the fact that there are not enough regulators, and I'm just wondering what regulations still exist for them to enforce. Glass-Steagall is over. You know, the uptick on the market is no longer in existence, and you said the Community Reinvestment Act has been weakened. What are the regulations that exist at the moment, and what is Congress talking about in terms of creating more regulations?
Okay, during the crisis, they still existed all of the accounting rules that said you had to comply with generally accepted accounting principles, and none of these people complied with generally accepted accounting principles for obvious reasons. When you have massive mortgage fraud, it inherently leads to massive accounting fraud. Right? That's indeed the goal. And in addition to that, banking regulators have the authority to take action against any unsafe and unsound practice. And we deliberately kept that very broad because we know any specific prohibition, it's easy to evade, right? You just put a little fillip on and it's something different. So they could have used that safety and soundness. And as a result of real reforms adopted in response to the savings and loan crisis, the banking regulatory agencies, and this included the Office of Thrift Supervision, had substantial enforcement powers to seek civil money penalties of hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to remove and prohibit officers forever from all of the banking industry, to take cease and desist orders. When I was a lead enforcement director, we had in a single year, I think it was over 800 enforcement actions in savings and loan. As you would expect, serious enforcement actions essentially ceased as long as the guy in charge is going around with a chainsaw saying that, and promoting the Daryl Dokos of the world, who was the guy that had been demoted 7 levels out of the savings and loan stuff and is brought back, and then is tossed out of the agency again when he permits IndyBac to backdate documents to make its accounting look better.
So political will is what's needed, and Obama's survival depends on it. So,
well, there are a lot of better regulators. They're experienced, effective regulators. They were, not in charge. There's no reason they can't be put back in charge.
So let us thank our guest here tonight, Bill Black.